One of the things that makes the universe of Dune so unique when compared to other prominent sci-fi franchises is the fact that even though it's the far future, there are no robots. Just by itself, that fact is a pretty unusual one. Robots have been a staple of science fiction since at least the pulp stories of the 1920s. Though admittedly in those days they mostly existed as disposable enemies that the hero could destroy without any moral quandaries. They were sort of your go-to default villain like Nazis are in a lot of video games. But again, there are no robots in Dune. No thinking machines, and barely any computers. This is especially bizarre from a 21st century perspective where we pretty much use computers for almost everything now. But not in Dune. It's just so unusual. More to the point, though, the in-universe reason as to why there are no robots in Dune says quite a lot about not just the universe, but about the author himself and his views on human nature. Welcome to Brainstorm Lore, and welcome to Dune. Talking about the Butlerian Jihad is tricky. This is mostly due to a dispute over canon. You see, the vast majority of the information we know about the Butlerian Jihad is contained in a trilogy of books written by Frank Herbert's son Brian Herbert and co-written by sci-fi author Kevin J. Anderson. The pair have since written a lot of other Dune books, including the books Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, which were intended to conclude the saga that Frank Herbert was unable to finish before he died. The dispute is mostly between those who accept the Brian Herbert Anderson books as legitimate canon and the Frank Herbert purists who do not. The purist argument is that, despite the claims by both Brian and Anderson that their books are based on notes left by Frank Herbert himself, the expanded Dune books depart from, and in some places contradict, the original themes, ideas, and intent of the original Dune saga. Of course, this will never be fully confirmed until the notes Henderson and Brian refer to are made public. For this video, although I will provide a summary of the Butlerian Jihad trilogy for comparison, I am mostly going to limit myself to what little information about the Butlerian Jihad is revealed in the original 6 books. Perhaps at a later date I will go over the Butlerian Jihad trilogy itself. In the meantime though, let's begin. Unfortunately, this means that there's very little information to go on, really. This is not entirely surprising. The Butlerian Jihad does take place 10,000 years prior to the first book. The most complete bit of information we get about what happened is one line from the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moheim. Quote, "Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them." End quote. This by itself is an interesting departure from the norm. Most science fiction that worries about the dangers of artificial intelligence think that the problem comes when we humans, in our foolishness and hubris, end up creating our betters and end up being replaced or simply taken over. This is a sci-fi tradition that goes all the way back to the very first story that invented the word robot, the Czech play Rossum's Universal Robots by Karel Čapek. This is where Herbert seems to diverge from your typical sci-fi writer. His concern is not so much with the robots themselves and what threat they might pose, but rather how the robots affect humanity. This seems especially relevant when you consider that our own society has become increasingly dependent on technology and ever more advanced computers to function. What Frank Herbert seems to have been afraid of was not so much technology itself, but our own dependence on technology. This is perhaps best summed up in a scene from the 4th book, God Emperor of Dune. Let me set up the scene to provide some context. 2 characters, Emperor Leto II and Siona Atreides, are traveling across a desert. At some point during the journey, Siona realizes that the face mask of her still suit was not properly in place, and as a result she has lost a dangerous amount of her body's water, meaning she may not be able to survive the journey. As they travel, Leto reveals to Siona that a faction within the Imperium, known as the Ixians, are trying to recreate thinking machines in defiance of the laws, both legal and religious, that were set down by the Butlerian Jihad. He says to her, quote, "What do such machines really do? They increase the number of things we can do without thinking. Things we do without thinking. There's the real danger. Look how long you walked across this desert without thinking about your face mask, unquote. When Siona replies that Leto could have warned her about her face mask, Leto replies, and increased your dependency. Herbert's concern here, and I do believe that this is indeed Herbert speaking through one of his characters in this particular moment, is not merely humans' over-reliance on technology. He's also concerned about our willingness, indeed our eagerness, to absolve ourselves of personal responsibility, which of course grants other people the chance to wield power over us. And most important of all these personal responsibilities is the responsibility of thinking for yourself. This of course ties into one of the biggest overarching themes presented in the Dune saga, Herbert's concern about people's willingness to blindly follow charismatic leaders. It doesn't matter if they're bad like the Baron Harkonnen, or even, at the very least, well-meaning like Duke Leto or Paul himself. Herbert, in no uncertain terms, rejects the idea of blind obedience to a leader, especially charismatic leaders, because whether good or bad, they will use whatever methods they deem necessary to persuade you to just listen and believe. It's a bit of a side detail, but I think it is relevant to point out that in the first book, the very first thing the Atreides do after they've moved to Arrakis is set up a film production studio to make propaganda films for House Atreides. And of course, the fact that Paul arrives with his Bene Gesserit mother has half the Fremen convinced that he is indeed the Messiah that has long been prophesied. And of course, when his family is nearly wiped out by the Harkonnens, Paul is all too willing to take advantage of the Fremen's credulity and use it to avenge his house. Of course, he then discovers too late that he has started a movement that he will not be able to stop, a jihad that will result in the deaths of 6 billion otherwise innocent people. And all because of the blind obedience of the Fremen, not to Paul Atreides, but to Muad'Dib, the Messiah they believe him to be. But, going back to the subject of jihads, how did Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson present the Butlerian Jihad in their prequel trilogy? Well, initially the story starts out as it was described by the Reverend Mother. 10,000 years ago, the vast majority of humans' holdings in space were ruled by the Titans, a small elite cabal of heavily cybernetically augmented humans who possessed a near stranglehold on all advanced technology, most importantly, an interconnected series of AIs on different planets known collectively as Omnius. To cut a long story short, Omnius eventually supplants the Titans and instead of seeking to rule humanity, decides to try and wipe them out. Eventually, of course, Omnius is defeated, the prohibition against artificial intelligence is established in the Orange Catholic Bible, which inevitably results in humanity developing alternatives to computers, such as the Mentats or the Guild Navigators. Honestly, I do see where a lot of the Frank Herbert purists are coming from here. It would have been a lot more interesting, and certainly more original, to leave the Titans as the main villains of the Butlerian Jihad, and it arguably would be more in keeping with Herbert's original ideas. But in the end, that's just my opinion. What's yours? Please leave a comment down below as to what you think of the expanded Dune books and the Butlerian Jihad and what it symbolizes, as I really would like to get a discussion going on this subject. While you're at it, please like and subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. Next week will be about some of the institutions that resulted from the Butlerian Jihad and the outlawing of advanced computers, starting with the Spacing Guild. Until then.